As soon as P14 launched, I noticed that something felt off about the damage on my Spirit-Blessed Juniper, but with all the changes to rune activation, I didn't have time to really dig into what was happening. Then last week I started working on a build guide for Mirafware, and I noticed that both my Spirit builds and my Courage builds just weren't as effective as they'd been in P13. So I got to collecting data and enlisted Cammy's help, and what we discovered genuinely shocked us. P14 came with some unannounced changes to how damage is calculated. I know in my last video I said the basics of damage calculation are the same, and I did not realize at the time that this is a half-truth. The way attunement pips contribute to weapon damage has not changed, nor have the formulas for calculating weapon damage caps, but the headshot multiplier has changed. Magic weapons and melee attacks are no longer able to headshot at all. This probably doesn't affect melee combat much, since throwing your melee weapon can still headshot, but magic weapons are definitely suffering from losing that damage. And there's another change that massively impacts bow builds. Bow damage in Soulframe primarily relies on multipliers. While you can fire off quick shots, the damage for those light attacks caps out pretty easily and isn't super impressive. This is fine, actually, and balances the benefit of being able to shoot at range. Fully charged shots will deal more damage, fly faster, and have less of an arc, so they are easier to aim at distant targets. This is also fine, and in general hits a pretty good balance, although Avex's absurdly slow charge rate is an extremely unfortunate exception. Anyway, here is how headshot damage was calculated in Preludes 13. On bows, Grace builds were a bit stronger than any other virtue, both because of that extra 0.3 damage from Grace scaling that all weapons get, and because you get an extra 1% added to your headshot multiplier per point in Grace. So, to give us an example, let's look at this Thistle that I blessed with 1 pip of Courage specifically for this video. A fully charged shot against a barrel gives us 168 damage when I have 40 Courage and 12 Grace, or 176 damage when I have 12 Courage and 40 Grace. If we use the P13 formula to figure out what our headshots would be on those builds, we'd end up with 427 damage on our Courage build and 507 damage on our Grace build. Let's set aside for a moment the debate about whether or not Soulframe should have classes, and for now just think about how this affects game balance and player agency. There's a meaningful damage boost here if you use a Grace build, but the Courage build still works well enough to be viable in endgame content, even if it's not technically the best. If Soulframe is going to have classes, this is a fine way to do it. Give an advantage to people who play into their class archetype, and give players the option to build differently and still build well. However, in Preludes 14, the headshot formula changed from this to this. The base multiplier was significantly reduced, and the part that scales with Grace got 3 times stronger. So here I am with my Thistle with 1 pip each in Courage and Grace, and on my 40 Courage 12 Grace build, my fully charged headshot deals 254 damage, while on my 12 Courage 40 Grace build, my fully charged headshot deals 416 damage. That's a roughly 40% damage loss for going Courage instead of Grace. But let's take this a little further and look at what happens when the enemies have more armor and my build fully focuses on one virtue or the other. I reset all my packed upgrades on this Garen Rude build so that I could get to 37 Courage with only 3 Grace, or 37 Grace with only 3 Courage, and traveled up to the northeast corner of the map to shoot enemies with more armor. On the Courage build, a body shot for 115 damage became a headshot for 161 damage. On the Grace build, a body shot for 113 damage became a headshot for 335 damage. So now we're up to a roughly 50% damage loss for using Courage instead of Grace. And this damage loss gets even more extreme when you include the stealth multiplier. That multiplier itself has not changed in P14, but the way it stacks with the headshot multiplier makes the Grace problem much, much worse. In my low-level tests with 40 Courage and 12 Grace, or 12 Courage and 40 Grace, a stealth headshot hit for 318 damage on the Courage build and 754 damage on the Grace build. And once again, the difference gets more extreme in our high-level tests with more armor and full single virtue investment. At 37 Courage and 3 Grace, the stealth headshot hit for 199 damage, and at 37 Grace and 3 Courage, it hit for 662 damage. I'm going to take a guess that DE is trying to balance Grace multipliers. P14 was supposed to change Garen Rude so that Behest alerted enemies, but I'm still getting stealth multipliers, and Bestone definitely opens enemies up to stealth, making Oshelda stronger on Grace than on any other virtue. Perhaps this headshot change was an attempt to tone down headshot multipliers but keep them intact on Grace builds, because that is the whole point of Grace in our new Virtue class system. It's an idea that makes sense on paper, but only when you're not considering how much bow damage relies on those headshots. Unless they wanted to double down on Virtue classes and prevent bows from using other virtues at all. But is that what DE is trying to do here? What is the goal? Why give us dual virtue bows but then punish us for actually using them? Why lower the virtue requirements while at the same time increasing the penalty for not using the class virtue? I actually don't think a nerf to non-Grace bows was DE's intent here. Other weapons are still able to work with any virtue and be reasonably viable even when not technically best, although admittedly this is in part because magic weapons are no longer able to headshot at all. I don't think this is a great move, but it at least means Seathorn hasn't instantly become the only staff worth using. And while Flyblades and thrown melee weapons can still headshot, that's not how most people tend to use those weapons. So this change primarily affects bows, and thus I don't think this is DE's way of doubling down on virtue classes, otherwise we'd see a change that affects all grip types. So what was this about then? What were they trying to fix? The only thing I could come up with that made any sort of sense was that maybe they didn't care for the 100,000 damage headshot I made in my Goodbye P13 video. Which is fair, that's not a number that should be in Soulframe. But if that is what DE was trying to fix, which is just my guess, I don't actually know if that is true, were they successful? There's only one way to find out. I assembled a squad, and with help from Cammy and Skull, we tested several ways to use the tools available to us in Preludes 14 to see how high we could get a Fellust buffed headshot. I'm on Tethrin, Cammy is on Oshelda for Bestone, and Skull brought Duello since it can buff both Cammy's Courage for Bestone and my highest virtue for more damage. For comparison, our P13 best, not counting the Rat Totem bug, was 100,711 damage. On a similar Courage build in P14, even with better buffing through Duello, I only got up to 86,710 damage. So, progress, right? Well, no, because when we switched from full Courage to a split virtue build, that damage went up to 124,807, and when I took just enough Courage to get a 6th stack of Fellust and put everything else into Grace, I got up to 136,857 damage. So, if the intent was to nerf the interaction between Fellust and bows, this attempt was not successful. I did also test what would happen on solo builds without all the virtue potions and squad buffs. If you're not taking stealth shots, then an Avex Courage build does actually win out here. It is the only use case for a non-Grace bow in Preludes 14. However, as soon as you add stealth, Grace performs better. That last part I don't have a problem with. Grace is supposed to perform better on stealth builds. That's not the issue here. The issue is that now it takes one of the strongest buffs in Soulframe just to make a non-Grace bow build viable, and without that buff, bows simply must run Grace in order to deal enough damage to comfortably complete endgame content. I don't blame DE for wanting to nerf Fellust headshots, which again might not be the issue here, but if it is, the problem isn't the headshot multiplier. It isn't even the stealth multiplier. The problem is Fellust and Bestone. When we swapped Oshelda for Orengal to max out my Grace, my headshot only got up to 31,211 damage. That's still a lot, but the point is that Bestone's multiplier is doing a lot of heavy lifting for those huge numbers. If Bestone and Fellust added damage that was applied after multipliers, I wouldn't be able to get anywhere near 136,000 damage. And these crazy headshots are mostly for the fun of seeing what's possible with the tools we have. They take quite a bit of setup and are not at all practical for casual gameplay. So, while I do think Fellust and Bestone need a balance pass, I do not think it should come with such a complete nerf to Courage and especially Spirit bow builds. Grace already had enough incentive in P13 without nerfing bows for other virtues, and there are much better ways to balance the interactions between Soulframe's various multipliers. So, where does that leave us? Unless and until there is a change to the headshot multiplier, all bow builds are Grace builds, with the sole exception of a non-stealth Courage Avex on Tethrin. While I would love to present you all with more variety and creativity in my builds and guides, that's going to have to wait for some changes. For now, we've got to build for the game we have, so if you want to play bow and do damage, go full Grace with a Grace armor and a Grace talisman and a pact with a Grace arcanic you enjoy. As for which bow to use, my advice is to stick with whichever bow you have that has a maxed out grace attunement. The Starling is an easy choice if you have it, and a Grace Blessed Maestro is a pretty close second place. A Grace Blessed Juniper is fine as long as you're using a Wild Pact and can meet the Spirit requirement without having to put any extra points in Spirit, because any point you put in Spirit will amount to a damage loss far more significant than the sliver of cooldown reduction you get in its place. Totems at least have a few different viable options depending on how you like to play, and both bow runes are still useful, although I'm waiting on that keybind before we cover runes in more detail. So there is at least some space for creativity in how you build the bow itself, but your Prism and Pact are either Tethran with Courage or anything else with Grace. I don't like it, but it is what it is. I hope this information will help you have more fun with your bow builds while we wait to see if DE sticks with these changes. And I do still have hope for some changes. Whether you agree with my analysis or not, please keep sharing your feedback in the forums and the official Discord. DE does listen to its players, but changes take time, and we don't know what the goal of this change really was or what they're working on behind the scenes. I will never stop hoping that DE abandons this class system and reclaims the brilliance of Soulframe's original unlimited creativity in our builds and in our combat, but until then, every bow build is going to be a Grace build, and now you know why. Thank you again to Cami for her mathematical brilliance, and to Springroll and Skull for help with testing and analysis, and thank you for joining me on the ups and downs of this pre-alpha journey. Let me know in the comments what you think of these headshot changes, and until next time, happy hunting!